Welcome to a special episode of the Archetypal Mosaic. This is Mikhail Tank. On the phone is an incredibly interesting guest, Judith Hewitt, the museum director for the Museum of Witchcraft in England. Welcome, Judith.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Now, how did you become interested in witchcraft and in the Museum of Witchcraft?
It's quite a long story. I come at it from more of a historical perspective. I studied history at university, and my husband studied museum studies and folklore to PhD level, and he was looking for a job that incorporated museums and folklore and folk belief. And when he saw the job at the Museum of Witchcraft in Boscastle, he decided that he was going to apply for it. But when he looked at the sort of job description, it didn't really sort of suit what he was about. He's more about research, whereas I was in more of a management role in my previous job. So we both decided to apply together for the same job. And luckily the director of the museum, Simon Costin, thought that it would be great to have both of us and utilise both our skills. So we both ended up working at the museum. So myself and my husband are the managers of the museum, and we run it together, and we're very happy living and working at the museum in Boscastle.
Wonderful. Now tell me, how did the location get found? What is the backstory of the location?
Well, the museum's got a very long and checkered history. It started in about 1951, and in its first sort of 9 years, it moved around a great deal, tried lots of different locations, didn't seem to fit. It was persecuted in some places, just not welcome in others, financially unviable in other places. And eventually in 1960, the founder of the museum, Cecil Williamson, hit upon Boscastle as a place where he was going to open the museum. He called it the Witch's House. The building that the museum is currently in is the same one. So local legend has it that it was a home of a witch, and Cecil bought the building. It was actually a rundown warehouse, but it may have been lived in at some point by someone. And he had the vision to see this rundown warehouse in Boscastle, which is a sleepy little fishing village, that it had the potential to be a fantastic museum. We think he was drawn to Boscastle because, again, he'd heard stories of the witches of Boscastle who would go down to the harbour and sell the wind to the sailors by charming knots into a rope. So you'd tie 3 knots into a rope, and with each knot you would say a charm or tie a bird's feather into the knot, and then sell it to the sailors, so when they were out at sea in their sailboats, they could untie those knots and raise the wind to get the desired effect, so they could travel around and catch their fish and get where they were going. So we think Cecil was drawn to Boscastle because of those legends of the witches of Boscastle selling the wind, because he'd heard that this house, this rundown warehouse, had the nickname the Witch's House. And also about 3 miles from here, on the way to Tintagel, there are some rock carvings in a wall known as the Labyrinths of Rocky Valley. And Cecil wrote, in our archive, we have a writing of Cecil saying that that's why the museum's here, is because he saw those ancient rock carvings as an example of man's magic making that goes back thousands of years, and he felt drawn to this area, this special place, this bit of Cornwall where it's jutting right out into the sea. It's wild, it's windswept, the people are unusual and different, and we're between the sea and the moorland, and they've got these amazing rock carvings. So even though Boscastle is remote and very small, the museum had tried in other places that were a bit more commercial perhaps, this is the place where it's stayed and succeeded. So it's been here since 1960, so obviously Cecil made the right choice. I think it was the 5th location he tried, but this is the one that's worked, and every year the museum's getting stronger and stronger and more successful, so we think he made a good choice.
Wonderful. Now, during Samhain and other holidays and seasonal changes, are there any special events, circles, and etc.?
That the museum's involved in? Yes, we have lots of different events at the museum throughout the year. We had on January the 6th, we celebrated Old Christmas, which is in Cornwall. The calendar changed in about 1750, and they moved Christmas to its traditional, where it is now, to December the 25th. And people in Cornwall still celebrated the old day of January the 6th as Christmas. So we had an old Christmas celebration with people dressed in costumes and doing guising, and wassailing as well, which is drinking cider to ward off the spirits of winter. So we had that on January the 6th, and we celebrate Midsummer as well in the middle of June. And we had the traditional dancing there, and we raised the midsummer birch tree, sort of a bit like a maple, which people danced around to celebrate the sun. And then on Samhain, October the 31st, or near there, we have an All Hallows Eve gathering, where we have Morris dances and processions, torchlit processions, and we celebrate the coming of the dark side of the year, and the Celtic New Year as Samhain is celebrated. So yeah, lots of events and lots of things going on connected with the museum.
Now, the website for the museum is museumofwitchcraftandmagic.co.uk. There's a place to shop and a place to read the history. Have you considered possibly doing a virtual mini exhibit so that people from all around the world who are so interested can kind of get a glance of what's available?
Yes, we did used to have a tour section, so you could kind of do like an online tour, but when the website changed, that got removed. But yes, we might put that back. But if people go to the website and they want to see what objects we have, on the top on the banner there's a section that says collections. And if you click on that, then you can search. All of our objects are online electronically. So if you put a keyword in, so say like charm or something like that, or a say may, or wand, and then you click the object box, then hundreds of objects will come up, and all the photographs are there and the descriptions as well. So people tend to use it a bit more like that, but yes, it's a good point. We could have more of a sort of online virtual section. But also on our website there's a section that says photos, and on there we have some selected photos of objects, and also sort of like what the museum interior looks like as well. So that gives people a bit of an idea. But if people want to know more, then we do have a guidebook which is for sale on our online shop, which is only £1.50, which isn't very much money. So if people are interested, that might be the best thing for them to get.
Wonderful. Now let's go to the objects and discuss a few, perhaps 4 or so that you can tell me about that are special to you.
Yes, well, the museum has nearly 4,000 objects now, so I have thought about a few that sort of stand out, though. There's one particular charm that we have that is said to be, we live in a part of Britain that's called the West Country, so it's the part that sort of sticks out into the Atlantic, and it's the furthest west in the sort of the United Kingdom. And there's a traditional West Country charm which is called a bees in the bag charm. And the idea behind this, I've often read that some types of magic making, or some people see magic making as sort of metaphor made real. And the sort of bee in a bag, if you think about a bee and the metaphor of a bee and what it stands for, it's sort of, it's busy, it works hard, it makes honey, it lives in a hive with other bees in quite a harmonious way. And the idea is if you could get the spirit of the bee with its hard-working honey nature and its, working together with others, if you could harness that spirit and bring it into your home, then you would have a successful, happy home where you will live in harmony with your family, where you work together to produce wealth, and you succeed. So the people in the West Country, in Devon and Cornwall, used to collect when they saw dead bees on windowsills or near hives or wherever. They would collect the dead bees, put 3 of them in a little bag, hang it in the window of their house to try and attract into their home the qualities of the bees. So I think that's a particularly nice example of people using sort of things that they find in nature to try and bring the magic of that animal and that creature into their home, and showing how magic can be about this sort of the nature and spirit of animals, as well as sort of the magician's working, if you see what I mean. It's as simple as collecting those things and putting them in a bag.
That's beautiful, and that's also very related to the show's title, Archetypal. That's exactly what archetypal energy is all about.
Yeah, absolutely. And so there's a couple of other objects that stand out to me. One of them is a huge obsidian mirror that we have, which is probably about sort of half a meter tall, a couple of feet tall, and a foot wide. And it was got a beautiful floral frame around the outside of it, so it's carved wood and colourful frame. That was probably one of our most precious objects. And as your listeners probably know about the use of dark mirrors and seeing into the other world and communing with the spirits and getting messages from the beyond, and not in the way that a normal mirror reflects this world. The dark mirror will show you other places, other things, other times, other realms. And this mirror was owned by Cecil Williamson, the founder of the museum. And it wasn't actually a museum object originally. When he passed away, staff from the museum were invited to go to his house and collect any objects that they thought should be in the museum. And this was actually Cecil when he passed away. This was on his desk. So obviously he had been using it and used it pretty much, all the time. So it's a very, very special object to all of us. And people who visit the museum are always telling us things that they see in the dark mirror. So it's a fascinating and beautiful piece. And it chimes in very much with a very strong magical tradition of people using crystal balls or pools of water or lit by the moon or dark mirrors like John Dee. So it's part of that very strong magical tradition, which we like to see Cecil as a part of that, continuing that tradition. And people visiting the museum are very intrigued by that.
That's fantastic, because the scrying mirror is also a way for the unconscious to show itself to the conscious. And it allows for things that we haven't seen or known to reveal themselves to us that actually may reside within us as well as outside. So that's really, really very cool. And have you scryed with the mirror? Have you seen anything?
No, I haven't myself. No, no, I can't say I have. But yes, we do regularly hear people who have used dark mirrors, or who have. Quite a common thing in this part of the world. People who couldn't afford something like a dark mirror, they would use glass fishing floats. So they have like a glass ball that would be attached to the nets. To keep the fishing float afloat. Actually, it looks very much like a crystal ball, so they would use that. And there's also we've also got a beautiful basin with a mirror on the bottom that was used by a wise woman in Cornwall. So yeah, there are lots of different examples of scrying that we have in the collection, but I haven't used any of them myself personally.
What about wands and brooms? Is there any wand and broom that stands out, and any history behind that?
Well, we have lots of different brooms. One of the ones that's quite unusual, we have ones that are painted beautifully, like the handle is painted beautifully for the different elements, so sort of bands going round. So it's kind of a traditional thing in this country. We have ones that have been used in people's hand fasting or weddings. But one that's quite unusual is one that we've got, which has a candle on the end. So it's actually not made of the traditional sort of birch wood. So it's made of palm. So it's very like grass-like, the broom end. And then on the handle, it's actually got a candle at the end. And Cecil said it was used by a Devon witch, I think it was, to fly to the Sabbath with a candle on the end. so that's quite an unusual one. So we have hundreds of wands. Ones that stand out to me. There's one that was used by a Welsh witch who passed away about 10 years ago, and he left his collection to the museum. And it looks like a snake, so it's beautifully it's a natural piece of wood, but it has almost like a snake's head at the end of it, and he added a couple of eyes to it, so that's quite a magical looking. It looks like it could slither away at any moment, so it's quite a beautiful, beautiful wand. We have another one which I don't really know very much about. I don't think anybody does, but it's like a long wand, almost more like a staff, but it is described as a wand, and it's got a claw at the end, so it's like an eagle's sort of talon at the end, holding a ball, which is very dramatic. Again, we actually don't know very much about that one, who made it. It's been in the museum since Cecil's day, but that's currently on loan to the British Library, because they have an exhibition at the moment on Harry Potter, and they asked if they could borrow that wand as a particularly beautiful example of a wand. But yes, we have hundreds. So if anyone ever visits the museum, we have a large display of wands, cauldrons, broomsticks, magical knives, swords, all sorts of things.
Now, what were the brooms used for?
What are they used for?
Mm-hmm.
They're obviously in sort of pop culture and things, they're for flying on. But in modern witchcraft, or witchcraft today, I should say, people tend to use wands to cleanse the ritual space. So if they draw out a circle, they might use it to sweep the circle, to cleanse it. And also, there are different spells that involve the use of either a broom or some a bird's feathers. You can either have banishing spells that involve sweeping it out, or drawing in spells that involve sweeping inwards. So we also have some goose's feathers that were used in that way. So you'd either sweep out the thing you wanted to get rid of, or sweep it in, depending on what you were thinking of. But wands are also used as hand fastings, so people jump over those as part of a wedding ceremony in pagan rites. So there's a variety of uses for brooms.
Now tell me, is the Isle of Avalon far from where the museum is, and is there mist that collects around it? Just kind of an off question.
It's the Isle of Avalon is Glastonbury. It's probably about 2 hours from the museum, so it's not too far. And the mists, yes, it's because it's on the Somerset Levels, I think. So yeah, it's the mists do definitely gather around it. That's it's not just a poetic name; it's quite accurate that the tour rises out of the mists.
Wonderful. Now, on your website, in the shop section, we have the British Book of Spells and Charms. We talk a little bit about the original text of English witchcraft. Which books specifically relate maybe to the museum and to the history, and maybe some of Cecil's favorites?
Cecil seems to have been particularly interested in, he was very interested in West Country witchcraft, which really there was not very much written about in his day. So he did most of his research by going out and speaking to people and actually meeting wise women and witches in Cornwall and Devon. But he also seems to have read Margaret Murray, The Horn God of the Witches. We have his copy of that. And he also had a copy of John Dee's The Account of Relations with Spirits. So he had an original copy of that too. So he seems to have been interested in sort of the Margaret Murray aspect and also John Dee. We also have a copy of Crowley's The Equinox, which I think Cecil probably also used quite a lot and referenced quite a lot. He had quite a fond impression of Aleister Crowley. He knew him, and met him several times, and writes about him with great affection. So those are probably the books that influenced Cecil. It's very hard to know, obviously, but those would be the books that we still have that he seems to have referenced quite a lot. In terms of witchcraft generally, in the museum generally, we have a lot of Gerald Gardner's objects, and Gerald Gardner was quite involved in the museum when it was on the Isle of Man in the 1950s. He used to be friendly with Cecil, but they did have a big falling out. But we still do have a lot of Gardner's objects, so any book by Gardner would be quite important in the history of witchcraft, but also in the history of the museum. In the more recent history of the museum, some of the books that have been quite influential are Gemma Gary's Traditional Witchcraft. We've used that quite a lot when we've been looking at doing displays and interpretation. She lives quite near here in Cornwall, and it's sort of a mutual relationship. She writes about the museum, and we use some of her writings in the museum as well. And she looks at the museum objects and uses them and helps us figure out how they were used and what their power and potency is. So any book by Jeremy Gary of Troy Books is highly recommended, and we do sell some of those on the online shop. And Steve Patterson, who's a good friend of the museum, wrote a book about Cecil and the museum called Cecil Williamson's Book of Witchcraft, a grimoire of the Museum of Witchcraft. And he also wrote a book about our Wise Woman's Cottage called Joan's Cottage, The Spells and Charms from the Wise Woman's Cottage. So those books are they're informed by the museum, and they're very, very helpful to us as well for helping to understand the collection better.
Wow, fantastic. Two follow-ups on that. Has Cecil wrote or maybe had an audio recording that's available in the museum? And also, I was going to specifically ask about Crowley's work and their friendship. And is there anything that he said or talked about Crowley? How was he to deal with? Any kind of tidbits of information? Because Crowley's work is extraordinary, of course.
Yes, yeah. Cecil, he didn't publish any books or anything like that. He wrote pamphlets and things for the museum. But he didn't publish. But you can actually see him on YouTube. So there is a really good old documentary of the Museum of Witchcraft, and Cecil's on that being interviewed. So that's probably one of the best ways to see him. In terms of his relationship with Crowley, he talks about him just incredibly affectionately. He sort of says, "This is the Crowley." There's a photograph of Crowley in our archive, and Cecil's written next to it, "This is the Crowley I knew and loved." And he also wrote something else, like "Hail to thee, Crowley." So I think he had a huge respect for him. We don't know how they met for the first time, but Cecil does write about visiting Crowley when he was in Hastings, which I think was in sort of the 1940s, 50s sort of time, so towards the end of Crowley's life. Cecil wrote about Crowley being down on his luck at that point and in financially not a very good condition, so it was sort of quite hard up. Crowley, we used to have several of Crowley's objects in the museum. At some point, these seem to have been sold. None of us have sold them, but I think when Cecil was maybe himself in hard up times and quite poor, and the museum wasn't doing so well, I think he might have sold them. But we used to have a painting that Crowley had done. We also used to have an original text in his handwriting, which we no longer have. A ring that Cecil was given to Cecil by Crowley, and also a stick with 3 heads, so 3 ram's heads on it. All of these we don't have anymore, unfortunately. They're long gone, and no one knows when they left, but they haven't been here for at least 30 years. But we do have a display of objects to do with Crowley at the moment, and we're actually expanding that this year for our exhibition, which will open in April the 1st. We've just recently been looking at our archive and the objects that we haven't had on display for a while, and realised that some of the paintings that we have are actually artworks done by Steffi Grant. whose partner Kenneth Grant has published great amount on Crowley and knew Crowley very well, and both the Grants knew Crowley. And we've just been looking at documents in our archives from the Grants to Cecil, talking about Crowley, and also from Gerald York, who knew Crowley as well. So our new exhibition is going to be quite a lot about Cecil's relationship with Crowley, and Kenneth and Steffi Grant as well. So that'll be an interesting, it's still a work in progress, but it should shed new light on the relationship between Crowley and Cecil, which is fascinating.
Now, that exhibit, you said it opened sometime in April. Will it be going through October, November?
It will, yes. It's going to be all year, so it's April until probably about January 2019. So it's for pretty much a whole year.
So for those listening to this episode during Samhain, you'll have a few months to visit and check out the museum if it's going to last a little longer. Now, there's always detractors. There's always people who say, what is this? Why is this? For people who, may not understand the museum and who may have kind of negative views due to their own misunderstandings, but how would you respond to them?
How I would see it is that people have a negative view of witchcraft perhaps because they don't understand it. And so I would just say this is why the museum's here. I think the museum is hugely important. When you sit here in summer and there's people, because it's quite a nice touristy place, Cornwall, and you hear people outside go, witchcraft, I don't want to go in there. And then they sort of say, oh no, come on, look, it looks interesting, let's go in and have a look. And then they come in, they look round, they maybe spend a lot longer here than they expected. And people always say on the way out, that was so interesting, that was so different to what I expected it would be. And it's so much more complex and so much more interesting, and actually I have a lot more sympathy for it than I expected I would have. Our first room in the exhibition is kind of the stereotype of the witch, the hag, the crone, the sort of the evil witch from most films and lots of art. And really looking at, that image of the witch comes from mostly from the 15th, 16th, 17th century, a time when women were persecuted, and men, but mostly women were persecuted just because they were labelled a witch. And what's really strange is, although we don't treat people like that anymore, and we don't burn women at the stake, and we don't hang them by the neck because they have unusual beliefs, although that time has gone, those ideas and that stereotype has remained. And so I think it really challenges people when they come into the museum and they have that stereotypical view, and they look round and they see that actually, if in the days before you had, in this country, free healthcare, in the days before you had the police or lawyers, when you were poor, when you were alone, when you needed advice, that there were these wise women who would offer you help and a way forward, and that there have been since those days great minds like Crowley, like Cecil, who maybe don't conform to the established religions and challenge the dogmas of the day, and maybe are persecuted for it or have a hard time for it, but actually that these are the people who have wisdom, who have truth, and who have the courage to speak about it and to talk about it as well. So hopefully I would say to people, if they have a problem with witchcraft, or they don't like magic, or they don't like the ideas of it, maybe why are you so threatened by it, and why are you so threatened by difference and new ideas, or different ideas, or very old ideas? And I would just say, come to the museum, have a look round, and if you still don't like it when you leave, come and speak to us, and there's always someone on the desk who would happily discuss anything with you, and hopefully you would see that there's a lot more to witchcraft than you might think.
Beautifully said. Now, just a couple more questions as we conclude the interview. The meaning of the pentagram. What is if you were to tell the audience, what is the purpose of the pentagram, or or some of the purposes?
The purpose, so the pentagram as a symbol, of course, is symbolizes the four elements, so air, earth, fire, water, and the quintessence, the fifth element, the unknown, the thing that people search for, which is the spirit, the thing that gives everything animus and gives matter meaning and makes all our lives worth living. So the pentagram symbolizes those five things in harmony, in balance. It also symbolizes man in the microcosm, or human beings in the microcosm. If you think of Leonardo da Vinci's Man in the Circle, or Vitruvian Man with his arms outstretched, that forms a pentacle as well. So, and that's kind of an idea from the sort of the ancient world that everything in the universe is in mankind as well. So, you can go and search for things to the end of the earth, but actually you might be better off starting looking inside yourself, and that man is the universe in microcosm, and the pentacle reminds us of that as well. So you see it in a lot of places. It's a magical symbol or glyph, and if you think, the more you think about it, the more there is to think about with it. And people use it in sigils and in talismans that they make. They believe that the shape itself has power, and is intrinsically powerful and magical, and it's a symbol that you can also meditate on and think about, and you might see it on one level and think you understand it, but the more you see it and the more you think about it, the more you might see through it into another level of reality, and understanding. So yes, people often think of it as or it's kind of been taken up by the Church of Satan. That's usually an inverted pentacle, which is upside down, so with this sort of pointy bit at the bottom. But generally speaking, it's a symbol of life and the universe, and it's a celebration of all those things. And that's why it's used by lots of pagans and witches today to celebrate life, essentially.
Beautiful. And finally, what are any of the future... You've already discussed the very interesting upcoming exhibit about Crowley and Cecil, but what are any other future plans that you'd like to discuss?
Well, the museum's always got lots going on. So this year's exhibition is called Dew of Heaven, and it's objects of ritual magic from the museum's collection. So it's a look at Golden Dawn, it's a look at Crowley, it's a look at Rosicrucianism as well. We have some objects to do with that. And also it's a look at the Kenneth and Steffi Grants and Cecil's relationship too. To coincide with that, we're in May, so May 2018, we're having a conference on ritual magic. So there'll be lots of different papers. We're having one of those a year now, so there will be one in May 2019 as well. And we have 2 days of speakers, and then we're also going to put that together into a book and publish that too. So something that's going to be coming this year is quite a few publications from the museum. We've started a journal last year called The Inquiring Eye of the Witchcraft Museum, the Witchcraft Research Centre, and we're going to publish that twice a year. So that's got different articles in it and all sorts of different interesting things. And so that'll be published twice a year. And next year we're also looking at publishing some of the books from our conferences that we've had. So we've already had 3 of those, and we're looking to publish those this year too. Other things that are coming up this year, the museum's got 2 exhibitions that are currently touring the world. There's one with the V&A, the Victorian Albert Museum. They did an exhibition looking at 60s counterculture, and they had a section on witchcraft as an expression of sort of rebellion in the 60s, or the sort of sexual liberation of the 60s. I think that exhibition is currently in Madrid. And I already mentioned the Harry Potter exhibition from the British Library, which I believe is coming to New York. So some of the museum objects are travelling across to America to go on display there. So there's lots going on. There's probably more. But yes, if people are interested, then we are on Facebook, and we have a website with a blog which we do update reasonably regularly. So and we also have an event section on our page where we put forthcoming events and things to keep an eye out for, so people can follow us there and see what's going on, because there's always lots happening.
Judith, it's been a true pleasure speaking with you. We've been talking to Judith, the museum manager of the Museum of Magic and Witchcraft in the United Kingdom. May the Samhain for the listeners of the Archetypal Mosaic and the museum goers be sweet, beautiful, and magical. Thank you.